Hi, my name's Dan Coflin. Welcome to another broadcast of What Does the Bible Really Say? Today we're going to be looking at Paul's thorn in the flesh. How many times have you heard that God gave Paul a thorn in the flesh to keep him humble? Well, let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, where we find this verse of Scripture. It says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." Paul goes on to say he asked the Lord to remove this thorn in the flesh, but God answered him by saying that his grace was sufficient for Paul. Paul then wrote, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Verse 9. It sounds like the Lord is requiring Paul to suffer with this infirmity so that everybody can see that it is God's power working in him, because Paul's too sick or too crippled or too blind or whatever people think was his thorn in the flesh to do the great things that Paul did. But is this really what the Scripture is saying here? Let's look at this verse more closely. The first thing we want to look at is, what does the Bible say the thorn in the flesh is? We don't have to wonder, because the Scriptures tell us the thorn in the flesh is the messenger of Satan to buffet Paul. The word messenger in the Greek language is angelos, and it's translated 179 times angel and 7 times messenger in the New Testament. Sometimes this word is in reference to a spiritual entity like an angel of God or demon of Satan, or several times it's in reference to people, such as James 2:25, where it says, the spies Joshua sent to Cana and were received by Rahab were called messengers. So we see that this demonic spirit or wicked angel was sent to buffet Paul. The word buffet means to rap with a fist. And you'll notice that the Scripture never says that God gave Paul this thorn, just that it was given to him. How is a spirit or angel of Satan going to buffet Paul? We don't need to look too far in Scripture to find out what happened to Paul on all of his missionary journeys. In Acts 13:44 through 52, we find Paul in the city of Antioch. He's preaching in the synagogue, and great crowds came to hear him. When the Jews saw the multitudes come to hear Paul, they were full of envy, verse 45 says. And then in verse 50, it says the Jews stirred up the people and raised persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their country. In Acts 14:1 through 6, Paul and Barnabas are in Iconium, and the same thing happened to them there. The unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and the Jewish rulers who intended to stone Paul, who had to flee to Lystra, a neighboring city. In verse 19, the Jews from Antioch and Iconium heard that Paul was in Lystra, and so they followed him there and stirred up the people, who then stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, thinking they had killed him. When the believers stood around, he rose up and the next day departed to another city. Paul had the same encounters on his next journey when, after he would preach the gospel, the Jews moved with envy, set all the city in an uproar, and again Paul had to flee for his life. He goes to Berea, but the rioters from the previous city followed Paul and stirred up the people against him. Acts 17:4 through 14 and Acts 18:12. When Paul was rehearsing to the Corinthians the many infirmities he suffered, he listed the many beatings and whippings and imprisonment, stoning, and other hardships. 2 Corinthians 11:23 through 28. You see, the messenger of Satan followed Paul around and constantly stirred up the people to buffet or beat Paul, not to keep him humble, but to keep the message of the gospel from being heard. Let's look again at 2 Corinthians 12:7. "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." You will notice that the statement, "lest I should be exalted above measure," is repeated twice in this same verse. The Greek word that is used here for exalted above measure is huper aero, and this is a compound word, huper and aero, and the meaning of these words together is exalted above measure, but separately it's above or beyond, across, and to lift up, to lift away, or to raise the voice. So this same word is used when Jesus was on trial before Pilate, and the crowd raised their voices and said, "Away with him, away with him." You see, these verses of Scripture We see that the reason this demonic messenger was sent was to keep Paul's voice from being heard as he declared the gospel. The people were stirred up and Paul was beaten and run out of town. He's not going to give Paul a demonic spirit, and neither is God going to do anything to impede the preaching of the gospel that he sent Paul to preach. Paul is writing to the Corinthian church where some of the leaders there are questioning Paul's authority as an apostle. This is what Paul is writing about in chapter 11. Paul says how foolish it is to glory and boast of what is accomplished in the flesh, verse 17. But because these leaders in Corinth who are coming against Paul are boasting in their qualifications, Paul then says, seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also, verse 18. Paul goes on to list all of the things that he suffered for Christ as he traveled and preached the gospel. Then in verse 12, Paul again declares how foolish it is to glory in what is done in the flesh. Paul continues to recount what happened to him 14 years prior when he was caught up to the third heaven. It's interesting to note that it was at the same time Paul was stoned in Lystra in Acts 14. Apparently, Paul was stoned to death and his body dragged out of the city, but then the disciples gathered around him, Acts 14:20. And Paul was raised from the dead and went back into the city. So Paul says that it is what I glory in. This is what I glory in. I glory in the work God does, not the work Paul can do. Paul says, I have nothing to glory in except my infirmities. 2 Corinthians 12:5. Do you hear what Paul's saying? He's not struggling with pride, just the opposite. He recognizes that he has nothing to glory in apart from the work that God does through him. Well, some would say yes, but why did Paul seek the Lord 3 times to be delivered from this infirmity, and God did not deliver him? Well, let's look at these scriptures more closely. Verse 8, Paul says he besought the Lord 3 times that it might depart from him. What is Paul talking about? What is the it? The it is the demonic spirit, which is Paul's thorn in the flesh, that continues to stir up the crowds and keep Paul's voice from being heard as he declares the gospel. Please note that in verse 9, God did not say, no, sorry, Paul, you're just going to have to endure this thing. What did God say? He said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. In this difficult situation, God said, my grace is sufficient. That means raising a barrier to ward off or to avail. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect, complete, or consummate, accomplished here, even in weakness, in want of strength or feebleness of mind or body. Paul was not being denied of the victory over this wicked work, just the opposite. Paul was reiterating what he had been declaring to the Corinthians all along. I will glory in my infirmities, my weakness and feebleness of mind or body, that the power of Christ might rest upon me, might abide with me, in me, and tent upon me. Later on, Paul would write to Timothy regarding these same afflictions he endured at Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. Here's what he says, out of them all the Lord delivered me, 2 Timothy 3:11. One last thought on this subject is concerning what Jesus told his disciples in John 16:33. In this world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. We will always have opposition in this world because we are not of this world. The only way God could deliver Paul from the many struggles of opposition he had in this world would be to take him out of this world. But instead, God's grace could give Paul victory over all the afflictions he faced. God's grace was not insufficient, but more than sufficient. Join me again for another broadcast of What Does the Bible Really Say?